Forget the roaring crowds. Erase the image of the emperor's thumb, poised between life and death. That romanticized brutality, the grand spectacle of the Colosseum, was a lie, a convenient illusion manufactured for history books. Because for the vast majority of Rome's condemned, the arena was never an option. The arena, in fact, was the merciful choice, a swift public end, granting a fleeting moment of dignity. There was another sentence, a punishment so insidious, so fundamentally dehumanizing, that even the Romans themselves whispered of it as the living death. This was damnatio ad metallia, condemnation to the mines. And once you truly grasp the depths of its horror, you will never view the Roman Empire, or the very foundations of its glory, in the same light again.
Every marble column, every gold coin, every architectural wonder that still awes the world today was quite literally built on a system of suffering. A system so calculated, so ruthlessly efficient, it made the Colosseum's theatrics look like child play. We must now descend into that darkness. Roman society saw prison not as rehabilitation, but as a temporary holding cell. Rome had no interest in reforming you. Rome was interested in making an example. They had perfected something far more terrifying than swift execution: erasure.
The moment a Roman judge uttered ad metallia, your existence as a human being, in the eyes of the law, simply ceased. Your citizenship was instantly revoked, property seized, marriage dissolved, children no longer legally yours. You were legally reclassified from person to instrument, a tool owned by the state with the same legal rights as a plow. You were the damnati, the condemned. You were legally dead before your eyes ever glimpsed the mine entrance. This sentence fell upon common criminals, political enemies, prisoners of war, and, increasingly, early Christians. Early Christian writers called it state-sponsored murder, stretched across years of torment. But here lay the grim genius of damnatio ad metallia. It was immensely profitable. The vast Roman Empire ran on minerals. Mining these essential resources was brutally dangerous work, rapidly consuming free laborers. Rome, ever practical, solved two problems at once: punishment and production.
Mines like Rio Tinto in Spain, Dacia's gold mines, or Egypt's Mons Claudianus quarries, these were the empire's economic engines. The very glory of the empire was quite literally built upon the slow, agonizing death of the forgotten. Your sentencing was complete. Ad metallia. Now began a journey, a brutal pilgrimage that for most would be the last time they ever saw the sun. Chained at the neck and ankles, you were lashed to a long line of other condemned souls. A journey to distant mines, like Spain, meant an 800-mile march, in chains, for weeks. Guards, indifferent to suffering, kept the line moving. Fall, and you were dragged. Unable to be dragged, you were beaten. Still unable to move, you were executed on the spot. Convoys often arrived with 30 to 40% fewer prisoners. New arrivals were often half dead, their spirits broken, before they'd struck a blow.
Then you arrived. The first thing to assault your senses was the smell: sulfur, rotting flesh, human waste, sweat, acrid smoke from oil lamps, a stench so vile that new arrivals immediately retched. You then saw hundreds of emaciated prisoners, barely human. Skeletal remains reveal shattered vertebrae, bones deformed by malnutrition, lungs caked in silica dust. The Greek geographer Agatharchides, visiting the Egyptian gold mines, wrote, "Those condemned to the mines are worked continuously, both by day and by night.
No relaxation is given to the sick, no consideration for the weak. All are compelled by blows to keep working until, overcome by ill treatment, they die in the midst of their torments. These wretches deem their future more dreadful than the present, and they long for death as more desirable than life.
You would be forced into 10 to 12-hour shifts, hundreds of feet underground, in absolute darkness. Tiny oil lamps barely pierced the gloom, filling toxic air with smoke. Temperatures could soar to 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Men collapsed from heat exhaustion within hours. With basic tools, your daily quota was impossible. You worked chained, always chained, connected to other prisoners. Chains prevented escape and ensured group casualties during constant mine collapses. The air itself was poison. Silica dust coated your lungs, literally turning them to stone in a disease called silicosis. Within months, you'd cough blood. Within 2 years, you'd be drowning on dry land. Cave-ins were constant. Romans used fire setting, which destabilized everything. Sections collapsed without warning. No rescues. Romans sealed off the section, making the collapsed tunnel a mass grave. Archaeological finds at Rio Tinto reveal human remains, still in chains, still clutching tools, buried where they fell 2,000 years ago. Food, a single meager meal daily of bread and scant water, approximately 1,200 to 1,500 calories, while burning 4,000 to 5,000. You were slowly starved, systematically worked to death. Prisoners lost 30 to 40% of their body weight in the first 6 months. You'd watch strong men become skeletal shadows, then collapse and die. Barracks, gastula, livestock pens, were underground chambers devoid of ventilation or sanitation. You slept in chains, packed with dozens of others, lying in filth. Disease spread like wildfire, dysentery, typhus, infections. No medical care. Fall ill, and you worked until death.
Average survival time ranged from 6 months to 3 years. Very few lasted longer. This was the punishment. This was the point. Maximum labor, maximum suffering. An efficient, profitable hell on earth. Who were these people? Romans kept virtually no records of the damnati. They were erased so completely that most names are lost. Yet, fragments remain. Christian martyrologies mention figures like Potamiana of Alexandria. Bishop Cyprian wrote to imprisoned Christians, "The world regards you as already dead, but in reality, you are more alive than those who condemned you." Archaeological evidence reveals more. Graffiti scratched into mine shafts, messages from prisoners who knew they'd never leave. At Rio Tinto, tally marks on stone, one set reaching 237 days before stopping. At Lorium, "Remember us," carved in Greek. 2 words, an anonymous plea across 2,000 years. These small acts of resistance, leaving a mark, counting days, are heartbreaking. They couldn't escape, couldn't fight, but they could leave a mark, a desperate hope that someday someone would know they had existed. And we must speak of the children. Yes, children. Roman law permitted condemnation of entire families. Wives, children, even infants could be sentenced alongside the accused. Skeletal remains of children, as young as 8 to 10, show the same mining trauma as adults. Imagine a child condemned to this fate, growing up in darkness and chains, knowing nothing else. These were not isolated cases. This was systematic. This was Roman justice. Let's return to the Colosseum, but with a stark recalibration. Everything you thought you knew about Roman justice, about the ultimate test of the arena, needs to be shattered now. Because the arena wasn't an alternative to the mines, it was an entirely different system, serving a wholly distinct, yet equally brutal purpose.
There was damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. This was the lunch break entertainment during gladiatorial games, literal intermission filler. Seneca the Younger, a Roman philosopher, described attending these spectacles. I come home more greedy, more cruel and inhuman, because I have been among human beings. By chance, I attended a midday exhibition, expecting fun, but it was pure murder. Unarmed prisoners with nothing to protect them were driven into the arena. Lions, bears, or leopards would be unleashed. Sometimes, victims were tied to stakes or even dressed in animal skins, specifically to excite the ravenous beasts. The result was predetermined, absolute. No one ever struck in vain, Seneca noted. Death usually came within minutes. A lion's bite, a bear's mauling. Brutal, public, terrifying, and swift.
Now, compare that to the mines. Which was worse? Even the Romans disagreed. Some legal texts suggested ad bestias was lighter because it was faster. Others argued being torn apart was more shameful. But these were not interchangeable punishments. They served different, equally cold functions. Damnatio ad bestias was spectacle. It was deterrence through public horror, making an example for the masses. But it was expensive. Maintaining exotic animals was costly, and the victim died too quickly to provide any economic value to the state. Damnatio ad metalla, on the other hand, was industrial. It was profitable. It was efficient. It disposed of Rome's enemies while simultaneously extracting valuable labor. But crucially, it was hidden, far from Rome, where most citizens would never witness its silent horror.
And the gladiators, those iconic figures of the arena, they were completely separate. Professional combatants, they received training, nutrition, even medical care. They were valuable investments. Their managers focused on their victories, their profits. A successful gladiator could become famous, earn wealth, and even buy freedom. Some garnered fanatical followings. This was categorically not the fate of the damnati. There is virtually no evidence of prisoners being promoted from the mines to gladiatorial combat. Why would there be? A person who had endured 6 months in the mines would be malnourished, diseased, utterly broken. They would make a terrible gladiator. The systems were entirely distinct. Condemned to the mines, you died in the mines. Condemned to the beasts, you died in the arena.
Later, as Christianity grew and public executions became controversial, Roman judges actually began to prefer mine sentences over arena deaths. A law from 325 AD suggested that judges should condemn criminals to the mines instead of bloody spectacles. This wasn't out of mercy. It was because public executions generated sympathy for the victims, especially the Christian martyrs. The mines were better, quieter. The public didn't have to watch. The condemned would simply disappear and continue generating revenue until their deaths. This tells you everything about Rome's ruthless priorities. Let us zoom out now and grasp the sheer, terrifying scale of this suffering. The Roman Empire operated dozens of major mining operations across its vast territory. Rio Tinto in Spain, Laurium in Greece, the gold mines of Dacia, Mons Claudianus in Egypt, operations in Sardinia and North Africa. Estimating the total number of deaths is nearly impossible, precisely because of how thoroughly the Romans erased the identities of the condemned. Yet, conservative estimates suggest hundreds of thousands of individuals who were condemned ad metalla over roughly 400 years.
Some scholars even suggest a number exceeding 1 million. 1 million people deliberately erased from history, their agonizing deaths fueling the very economy of the empire.
Wealth from Spain's silver mines funded military expansion. Gold from Dacia was so abundant that when Emperor Trajan conquered it in 106 AD, the spoils funded massive building projects in Rome. Trajan's Forum, Trajan's Market, architectural marvels that still stand today. The marble for the Pantheon? Much of it came from Mons Claudianus, where prisoners died cutting it. The lead pipes that brought water to Rome? Extracted from mines where people suffocated. The copper in Roman weapons? Mined by those condemned to never wield such tools as free citizens. Every single aspect of Roman civilization was built on this foundation of human suffering.
And the Romans knew it. They were not ignorant. They made deliberate choices. They calculated the economics. They measured productivity. They adjusted sentences based directly on labor needs. When the empire required more workers for the Spanish mines, conviction rates went up. When new quarries opened in Egypt, more prisoners were sent there. This wasn't accidental. This was a precisely managed, horrifying system. Tacitus, a prominent Roman historian, casually mentions that Emperor Tiberius sent so many people to the mines that it affected Rome's population. He doesn't express horror. He simply notes it as a matter of fact. That is how normalized this system had become within Roman society. This entire apparatus was legal, codified in Roman law. Jurists wrote treatises about the proper procedures for implementing it. They debated questions like whether pregnant women should be sentenced immediately or after giving birth. The consensus?
Wait until birth, then condemn the mother, and send the infant to be raised as a state slave. This, they believed, was civilization. This was law and order. This was one of history's greatest empires at its height. The monuments remain. The Colosseum still stands, a global icon, one of the world's most visited sites. Tourists flock there, snapping selfies, marveling at the engineering prowess of the Romans. But the mines? They are abandoned holes in the ground, far from any tourist path. No grand monuments mark their locations, only the occasional skeletal remains that archaeologists uncover, still in chains, still holding their tools. The condemned of Rome died twice, once in the mines and again in history's deliberate forgetting.
So, what are we meant to do with this information? What is the profound lesson hidden in the echoing silence of those underground graves? The immediate temptation is to view ancient Rome as fundamentally different from us, to dismiss this as ancient barbarism, a cruelty from which we, as a modern society, have thankfully evolved, to comfort ourselves with the belief that we would never be capable of such systematic, calculated brutality. But that is not the right lesson. That comforting thought is a dangerous delusion. What made damnatio ad metalla possible was not some inherent ancient barbarism unique to the Romans. It was the same insidious mechanism that makes atrocities possible in any era, in any society. The act of convincing yourself, as individuals and as a collective, that certain people aren't really people, that they are instruments, tools, resources to be exploited for a greater good.
The Romans didn't see themselves as evil. Far from it. They saw themselves as civilized, as bringers of order and law to a chaotic world. They built roads, aqueducts, sophisticated legal systems. They created enduring art and literature. Their contributions to human civilization are undeniable, foundational even. And yet, they built it all on a foundation of human beings they had legally, systematically declared to be non-persons. That is the true horror. Not that Romans were grotesque, bloodthirsty monsters, devoid of humanity, but that they were people, people just like us, who convinced themselves that their empire, their prosperity, their civilization was worth the cost of countless forgotten lives. They believed their ends justified these means.
When you visit Rome today, when you marvel at the Colosseum, or the majestic Pantheon, or the ruins of the Forum, take a moment. Remember that underneath it all, beneath the grandeur and the glory, is a hidden story. A story of systematic erasure, of lives literally ground to dust in the absolute darkness of the earth, of names lost to history, of people who suffered and died in unimaginable ways so that an empire could thrive. The crowd in the Colosseum was loud. The roar of 50,000 voices demanding blood was deafening. But the silence in the mines, broken only by the rhythmic clang of pickaxes and the ragged gasps of dying men, was absolute. And it is that silence, the silence of the erased, the forgotten, the systematically condemned, that should echo loudest across history.
Because those who refuse to speak for the silenced, those who choose to ignore these brutal truths, are condemned to repeat the pattern. They allow the same dehumanizing mechanisms to fester, to rebuild, under different guises, in different eras. The temptation to exploit, to other, to profit from another's suffering, is an enduring human flaw, not an ancient one. If you believe these are the stories that need to be told, the ones deliberately left out of textbooks, the ones that challenge comfortable, sanitized narratives about history, then this message is for you. This understanding is vital. The past is not a foreign country. It holds mirrors to our present. Consider the intricate legal frameworks the Romans built. They weren't just about controlling the populace, they were also about creating justification. The legal term servus pene, slave of punishment, was meticulously crafted to strip individuals of every legal right, transforming them into property. This wasn't merely practical, it was ideological. It allowed the Roman conscience to compartmentalize, to rationalize the horrors. They weren't enslaving people, they were merely utilizing state-owned tools. This legal sophistry extended beyond individuals to their families. The concept of damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory, was often applied to political enemies, literally erasing their names from public record. Damnatio ad metalla took this to a far more brutal, physical extreme. It was not just the memory that was condemned, but the very existence, the body, the life itself. The legal framework provided the necessary psychological distance, the bureaucratic shield, for the state and its citizens to carry out unspeakable acts without necessarily viewing themselves as evil. It was a system perfected not just for punishment, but for the exploitation of the human body to its absolute limit, then beyond. The average lifespan in the mines wasn't a failure of the system. It was the calculated optimal outcome. Why invest in long-term care for a prisoner when a constant supply of new condemned souls could be sourced? The economic model was clear. Maximum extraction of labor, minimum investment in human welfare, and a continuous churn of expendable lives. The empire's reach, its infrastructure, its military might, all benefited directly from this endless supply of forced labor. The logistical challenges of transporting tens of thousands of chained individuals across vast distances, then managing them in brutal underground conditions, were immense, yet the Romans solved them with chilling efficiency.
This wasn't chaos. It was an organized, state-sanctioned industry of human destruction. This understanding forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, prosperity, and the price of progress. It reveals how easily a society can normalize extreme cruelty when it serves a perceived greater good, when certain groups are stripped of their humanity, when their suffering is made invisible. The Roman Empire, in its brilliance and its barbarity, serves as a timeless, stark warning. The story of damnatio at Metalla is not merely a dark chapter from a distant past. It is a profound echo, a whisper across millennia that resonates with timeless lessons. It forces us to ask ourselves, how truly different are we, as human beings, from those who built an empire on such a foundation? The impulse to exploit, to categorize, to dehumanize remains a potent, destructive force in the human psyche. We may no longer chain people in mines or send them to fight beasts in arenas, but the subtle, insidious ways in which societies still identify others, those deemed less worthy, less human, less deserving of rights or dignity, are disturbingly persistent. Whether it is through economic systems that exploit the vulnerable, through social structures that marginalize entire groups, or through political narratives that demonize perceived enemies, the spirit of erasure continues to manifest. The Romans justified their actions with a legal framework that reclassified humans as instruments. Today, similar justifications can be found in economic theories that prioritize profit over human well-being, in security doctrines that sacrifice individual freedoms for collective safety, or in cultural biases that perpetuate systemic inequality.
The language changes, the context shifts, but the underlying mechanism, the act of convincing ourselves that certain lives are expendable for a greater cause, remains chillingly familiar. This narrative isn't about shaming ancient Romans. It's about understanding the universal human capacity for both immense creation and unimaginable cruelty. It's about recognizing that civilization, in its most magnificent forms, can coexist with the most profound ethical blindness. It's about acknowledging that progress is often built on the backs of the suffering, and that the narratives we choose to tell about history can obscure more than they reveal. By unearthing these stories, by giving voice to the silenced, we are not simply recounting historical facts. We are engaging in an act of remembrance, a moral reckoning. We are asserting that every life has value, that every person deserves to be seen, to be remembered, regardless of how thoroughly an oppressive system tried to erase them.
The gladiator's roar, the emperor's decree, the public spectacle of the arena, these were designed to intimidate, to control, to create a visible deterrent. But the silent, hidden horror of the mines served a different, more chilling purpose: to dispose of undesirables efficiently, profitably, and without public scrutiny. The absence of public witness made the suffering all the more absolute, the dehumanization all the more complete. When no one is watching, the abyss of human cruelty deepens without limit. So, when you encounter narratives of power and triumph, whether from ancient Rome or from any other era, cultivate a critical eye. Ask whose stories are being told, and more importantly, whose stories are being omitted, whose suffering is being erased to maintain a comfortable, triumphant version of history. Every grand achievement, every magnificent structure, every period of prosperity has a cost, and that cost is invariably paid by those whose names rarely make it into the textbooks, whose sacrifices are quietly buried beneath the foundations of glory. This awareness should not lead to despair, but to vigilance. It should inspire us to challenge narratives that seek to dehumanize or diminish any group of people. It should compel us to look beyond the glittering facades of power and prosperity, to seek out the hidden costs, the untold stories, the echoes of suffering that ripple through time. The stories of the damnati are not just cautionary tales about Roman justice. They are urgent reminders about the fragile nature of human dignity, the corrosive power of systemic dehumanization, and the enduring responsibility we all share to speak for the silenced. To remember those who were deliberately forgotten is an act of profound human solidarity. It is an acknowledgement that their lives mattered, and that the lessons of their suffering are vital for our own understanding of justice, compassion, and true civilization.
So, the next time you hear of Rome's grandeur or witness any impressive monument to human achievement, let the silence of the mines resonate within you. Let it be a reminder that true history is not just about the monuments that remain, but about the countless people who were buried beneath them, whose unseen labor and suffering formed the very bedrock of what we now admire. It is through remembering their erased existence that we truly begin to understand the full, complex, and often brutal tapestry of human civilization. Their silent plea, "Remember us," finally answered after 2 millennia.